In the heart of Harlem, during the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, a new kind of power emerged from the shadows. Harlem was alive with jazz and cultural revolution, but beneath the glitz and glamour, a darker world thrived. Amidst the backdrop of economic despair and crime, one man's influence loomed large. He maneuvered through a labyrinth of vice and ambition, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. His presence was felt beyond Harlem, shaping destinies and altering the city's course. This man, a formidable force in the criminal underworld, would become a legend in his own right. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, or better known as Bumpy Johnson. Frank Lucas, a major heroin dealer of the 1970s, started out in Harlem as a bodyguard for Bumpy Johnson. He remarked, "If you wanted to do business in Harlem, you had to go through Bumpy Johnson or you were finished." Lucas recounted how he would join Bumpy for lunch twice a week at a 57th Street restaurant, where they met with mobster Frank Costello. However, according to Bumpy's wife, Mamie Johnson, this was far from the truth. In her memoir, she described Lucas as an errand boy at best, and rejected his claims of being Bumpy's close confidant. Anyway, now that we've addressed the contrasting perspectives, let's continue with the real story of the Godfather of Harlem himself, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a man whose influence shaped Harlem's criminal underworld for decades. Around the age of 1 or 2, Bumpy Johnson began living year-round with his father and older brother Willie, as his mother worked 2 jobs. One in Charleston, where the family lived, and the other in New York. She took her 3 eldest daughters, Pauline, Mabel, and Lena, to help with her domestic work in New York, returning to Charleston only when her seasonal job ended. Her frequent absences created a void for young Bumpy, who sought a maternal figure in his older sisters. Despite these challenges, Bumpy excelled in school. His intelligence and talkative nature led him to skip 2 grades in Charleston Public School. Ironically, despite his family's emphasis on education, Bumpy never finished high school. Embarrassed by this, he often lied about attending prestigious schools in Charleston or universities in New York. His brilliance was so apparent that few questioned his claims. Bumpy also had a rebellious nature and was deeply sensitive to the racial injustices faced by African American people in the segregated South. His family encountered this firsthand when he was 10 years old, after his 19-year-old brother Willie was accused of killing a white man in South Carolina, a state notorious for its brutal vigilante justice against African American individuals accused of crimes. The lynching of Kit Bookhart in 1904 in nearby Berkeley County served as a grim reminder of the dangers Bumpy's family faced. They quickly sent Willie to New York, where Bumpy's sisters already lived, and in 1919, 14-year-old Bumpy joined them. His father arranged for him to live with his sister Mabel in Harlem, hoping for a better future. Though small for his age, Bumpy had a tough attitude. On his first day of school, he crossed paths with a group of local teenagers including 6 and 8, Junie, Nat, and Finley. When 6 tried to intimidate him, Bumpy stood his ground. After dodging 6's punch, Bumpy swiftly countered, breaking his opponent's nose and overpowering him. Though Finley complained about Bumpy's tactics, Nat, who had bet on Bumpy, intervened before the fight went too far. Following the altercation, Bumpy earned Nat, Junie, and Finley's respect, and the 3 became his closest friends, forming lifelong bonds. After the encounter with 6 and 8 and his crew, Bumpy never returned to school. Instead, he spent his days with his new friends, hustling for money by playing pool, shooting craps, or selling newspapers. They soon started sweeping sidewalks for local businesses, which led to even more earnings. Bumpy, clearly the brains of the group, quickly realized they could make a lot more by offering protection to the new stores in Harlem. This entrepreneurial streak led him to cross paths with Bub Hewlett, one of Harlem's most feared thugs. Known for his violent temper and towering frame, Bub was infamous for extorting local businesses in exchange for protection. One day, Bub approached a grocery store on 7th Avenue, only to discover the owner had already paid for protection, Bumpy's protection. Surprised and amused, Bub confronted Bumpy, who, at just 16, fearlessly stood his ground. Despite being much smaller and younger, Bumpy's boldness earned Bub's respect, and instead of fighting, Bub offered a partnership. This moment marked a major turning point in Bumpy's life, solidifying his rise in Harlem's criminal underworld. Though his sister Mabel was initially concerned about his dropping out of school, she eventually turned a blind eye as Bumpy began bringing home significant amounts of money. In the 1920s, Bumpy Johnson and his gang expanded their criminal activities beyond simple racketeering and burglaries. Initially offering protection to grocery stores and restaurants, they soon extended their services to clubs and speakeasies. As Bumpy's influence grew, Bub Hewlett, who had become a close ally, suggested a new opportunity, providing protection to the lucrative underground lottery operations in Harlem. These lottery operators, some of the wealthiest in the neighborhood, generated thousands of dollars each week, tax-free, and required the toughest bodyguards to protect their earnings. Bumpy saw this as a golden opportunity to increase his wealth and wasted no time jumping into the business. With his sharp instincts and fierce reputation, he quickly became one of Harlem's most sought-after bodyguards, solidifying his role as a key player in the underworld. Despite the racial barriers of the time, Bumpy Johnson's ability to rise above his impoverished background and self-educate was remarkable. In early 20th century Harlem, traditional opportunities for bright, ambitious African Americans were meager. By 1940, only 12% of African Americans completed high school, with just 2% earning a college degree. Additionally, less than 2% of professionals in the U.S. were African American, and the unemployment rate in Harlem was staggering. According to the New York Age in 1940, 80% of Harlem residents were either jobless or on work relief. It wasn't long before Bumpy crossed paths with Stephanie St. Clair, known as the numbers queen and leader of the 40 Thieves gang. Accounts of Stephanie's arrival in America vary, but one suggests she immigrated in 1912 via Marseille, France. By 1922, with $10,000 of her own money, she launched a numbers bank in Harlem. She became widely known as Queenie across Manhattan, but to Harlem residents she was respectfully called Madame St. Clair. Queenie was a tall, tough, and assertive woman with a softer side rarely shown. She led the infamous 40 Thieves, a feared extortion gang in New York. Even white gangsters avoided clashing with them or trying to take over their territory. The 40 Thieves had existed since the 19th century and were originally a white gang. Queenie's rise within such an established group was a testament to her leadership and persuasive abilities. Before long, she branched off from the gang to establish her own operations as a policy banker, gaining support from Harlem's black community for her numbers game. Within a year, she amassed a fortune of over $500,000 and had more than 40 runners and 10 comptrollers working for her. Bumpy Johnson admired Stephanie St. Clair not only for her class, but also for her unwavering willingness to fight for what was hers. This was put to the test in the 1930s, when the Mafia sought to take control of Harlem's profitable gambling scene. The underground lottery, known as the numbers game, had become immensely popular during the Great Depression. Players picked 3 numbers, and if theirs were drawn the next day, they won a prize based on their wager. However, there was a problem. Dutch Schultz, a brutal and paranoid gangster from the Bronx, who had built his fortune bootlegging alcohol during Prohibition. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, he needed new revenue streams, and Harlem's thriving lottery was a prime target. Schultz, notorious for his violent tendencies, wanted a cut of the action and began sending his men into Harlem to offer lottery owners protection from police and kidnappings, threats that his own men often orchestrated. This invasion into Harlem's gambling world posed a direct threat to Madame St. Clair, who controlled much of the numbers game in the neighborhood. Knowing Schultz's reputation for extreme violence, he once blinded a man by beating him and infecting him with a garment laced with an STD. St. Clair had every reason to be alarmed. The clash between Schultz's mob and St. Clair's operations was inevitable, and war loomed over Harlem. Bumpy Johnson's fearsome reputation made him the ideal enforcer. What Queenie didn't expect was that Bumpy Johnson was not only dangerous but also highly intelligent, though he was fiercely loyal to her. Bumpy Johnson had spent much of the late 1920s in and out of prison, serving time for burglary, assault, and theft. After completing a 2.5-year sentence by the end of 1931, Bumpy returned to a Harlem that was under siege. While he was away, Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of the Harlem numbers game, had been facing relentless pressure from Dutch Schultz organization. Schultz's violent campaign to dominate the Harlem lottery scene had left St. Clair's operations severely weakened. Her employees were terrorized, drive-by shootings became a constant threat, and many of her former allies had buckled under the weight of Schultz's brutal tactics. To make matters worse, Bub Hewlett, once an ally of Bumpy, had switched sides and was now working for Schultz, attempting to persuade St. Clair to surrender her business. Despite all this, St. Clair had managed to hold on to her empire, though it had shrunk significantly. But she knew she couldn't hold out much longer without help. There was one person who could stand up to Schultz's reign of terror and help her reclaim Harlem. Bumpy Johnson was about to make his return, and he wasn't one to back down, especially when it came to defending Harlem from those who sought to take what was theirs. His return would mark a turning point in the battle for Harlem's lucrative underworld. Just 2 days after his release from prison, 25-year-old Bumpy Johnson returned to the streets of Harlem, greeted by a landscape fraught with tension. He encountered Bub Hewlett, who was expected to offer Bumpy a chance to join Schultz's expanding empire. The air was thick with anticipation as Harlem watched to see which side Bumpy would choose. The choice became clearer when Bumpy met with Stephanie St. Clair and dozens of influential African Americans from Harlem. While many were skeptical and feared the consequences of opposing Schultz, some rallied behind Bumpy and St. Clair, marking the official start of the conflict between Schultz and St. Clair's faction. As the battle lines were drawn, Bumpy had the support of his loyal friends, Nat, Finley, and Junie, solidifying his position in the fight for Harlem's future. Bumpy's wife, Mamie Johnson, later described it as a guerrilla war, with Bumpy and his small crew of 9 men systematically eliminating Schultz's gang, one member at a time. The showdown between Bumpy Johnson and Bub Hewlett drew to a close in April 1933, when Bub was sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison on unrelated charges. With Bub sidelined, most of his followers abandoned the fight, leaving only a few loyalists, including Ulysses Rawlins. Ulysses Rawlins, who succeeded Bub as Schultz's top enforcer in Harlem, was determined to take down Bumpy. Despite Rawlins's fearsome reputation and his clear intent to challenge him, Bumpy was unfazed. He found the situation frustrating, as Dutch Schultz seldom visited Harlem and always traveled with heavy security, making direct confrontations difficult. In the summer of 1935, Bumpy Johnson and Ulysses Rawlins clashed for the first time. The confrontation occurred while Bumpy was on a date. As they walked, Rawlins suddenly attacked, pulling out a knife. The 2 men wrestled violently on the ground, with Bumpy eventually emerging victorious. He left Rawlins badly injured, with severe cuts and one eye hanging out of its socket. Bumpy casually stepped over Rawlins and continued his evening, saying he had a sudden craving for spaghetti and meatballs. Despite his grievous injuries, Rawlins was released from the hospital the same evening and sought revenge. He found Bumpy at a restaurant on 125th Street and fired at him, but the bullet only grazed Bumpy's hat and tragically struck an innocent woman, killing her. Rawlins was apprehended by a nearby police officer and faced a severe sentence for his actions. At this time, Bumpy still wanted Schultz, however. Schultz's downfall came mainly because of his determination to assassinate the United States Attorney Thomas Dewey, which caused friction within the mob. In 1935, Schultz was assassinated under orders from Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano then made a deal with Bumpy Johnson. In exchange for a share of the profits, the Mafia agreed to leave both Johnson and St. Clair alone, though she soon left the business, effectively giving control of Harlem to Johnson. As Mamie Johnson wrote, It wasn't a perfect solution, and not everyone was happy, but at the same time the people of Harlem realized Bumpy had ended the war without further bloodshed and had negotiated a peace with honor. While the agreement with the mob was controversial, it marked the first time a black man had successfully challenged the white mob and survived. Johnson was hailed as the Godfather of Harlem and maintained a lasting friendship with Lucky Luciano. Often seen as a Robin Hood figure, Johnson was known for giving back to his community, distributing free turkeys during Thanksgiving and delivering meals and gifts to the most vulnerable Harlemites. In 1937, Bumpy Johnson was arrested for assault and sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility, or sometimes colloquially referred to as Dannemora, the very same facility where Lucky Luciano was serving time. When Bumpy was released a decade later in 1947, Harlem had transformed, with the Italians firmly controlling the streets. Determined to reclaim his position, Bumpy went to the East Side to meet Joe Adonis, Luciano's acting chief of operations while Luciano was in exile. During that meeting, Bumpy was given the green light to operate, having earned the trust of figures like Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Tommy Lucchese, and Albert Anastasia. These were all key lieutenants, executing Luciano's orders both during his prison term and later from Italy. In 1948, Bumpy was introduced to a 19-year-old man who went by the name Flash Walker. Feeling pity for the young man, Bumpy took him under his wing and gave him a job to help his wife with some household chores. Flash eventually became Bumpy's driver, and according to some sources, his protégé. Bumpy began to trust Flash more and more and offered him a position in one of his lotteries. Flash knew how to charm people into betting more than they should have, so it didn't take long for him to be Bumpy's most profitable employee. Then came a point where Bumpy trusted Flash enough to let him accompany him to some important meetings, including those with the Italians. Before something happened that would completely alter their relationship, Flash and Bumpy were together for over 2 years. Flash Walker encountered a pimp in 1949 who offered him a big deal, and that's when it all started. The latter requested that he cash questionable checks, which appear to be stolen, without raising any red flags and without going through the bank. For Flash, it was an additional source of income to supplement what he was already making with Bumpy. So he agreed to the terms and deposited the checks into the man's bank account. After 4 months, Bumpy received a call from his bank requesting him to come in and talk about his account. He found out about the swindle there. Fortunately, he was able to resolve the issue. Not only did Bumpy finally give Flash a beating about the bogus checks, but it also seemed like Flash had touched his daughters, and not in a light-hearted manner. Flash tried contacting Bumpy later to ask for forgiveness, but he was ignored. As the Godfather of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's approval was required for anything involving crime in the neighborhood. Mamie Johnson noted, "If you wanted to do anything in Harlem, anything at all, you'd better stop and see Bumpy because he ran the place. If you want to open a numbers spot on the avenue, go see Bumpy. Thinking about turning your brownstone into a speakeasy? Check with Bumpy first." Anyone who bypassed Johnson would face the consequences. Johnson lived like a celebrity, wearing custom suits and luxury ties, having a high-profile affair with socialite and editor Helen Lawson, and even being featured in Jet magazine. From the 1930s to the 1960s, it was dangerous for any black gangster in Harlem to operate independently of La Cosa Nostra. Johnson, aware of this, took the smart route by serving as a middleman between the powerful Italian-American mob and the Harlem community. According to Lou Rice, Johnson acted as a criminal ambassador for the mob. White Italian-American gangsters weren't going to feel comfortable doing business on the streets of Harlem, Rice explained. The mob needed someone with respect and resources to manage their dealings in Harlem and collect their money. Bumpy was their guy. As a middleman, Johnson's role was to ensure the mob had no trouble in the neighborhood. Known for his persuasive skills, he settled disputes before they escalated into violence. If a member of the community caused issues with the mob, Johnson made sure it wouldn't happen again. By the 1950s, he had transitioned into legitimate business, opening a successful dry cleaning chain in Brooklyn with branches in other boroughs. Though he claimed he was going straight, he still found himself in legal trouble. In 1951, federal agents arrested Johnson and 11 others, charging them with conspiracy to sell narcotics. While Johnson insisted he was framed, the assistant U.S. attorney painted him as the leader of a major drug conspiracy, supplying a network of wholesalers. Prosecutors argued that no major heroin deal could take place without Johnson's consent, as he sourced his drugs both nationally and internationally. While out on bail, Bumpy Johnson found himself in a violent confrontation with Robert "the Hawk" Hawkins, a 32-year-old loud-mouthed troublemaker, outside the Vets Club in Harlem. Hawkins had been using profanity in front of women, which prompted Bumpy to tell him to leave. Initially, Hawkins complied, and it seemed like Bumpy had once again kept the peace. However, later that night at an after-hours spot on West 122nd Street, the two crossed paths again. Hawkins, now drunk and still swearing loudly, was daring anyone to stop him. Bumpy once more asked him to leave, but Hawkins ignored the request. When Bumpy called him outside to settle things, Hawkins left but returned 15 minutes later, more agitated. Hawkins started arguing with Bumpy, and when Bumpy approached him, Hawkins pulled a gun, threatening to kill him. Though unarmed, Bumpy kept walking toward him, cautioning Hawkins not to make a bad decision. Hawkins then fired, hitting Bumpy in the abdomen and chest. Bumpy collapsed on the sidewalk and was rushed to Sydenham Hospital with a 50-50 chance of survival. Despite his injuries, Bumpy refused to cooperate with the police, even when a detective suggested he might not make it. Bumpy retorted, "A man can die only once, and dead men make no excuses." Later, when a reporter whose newspaper claimed Bumpy had little chance of surviving approached him, Johnson responded, "I saw the headline saying I might die. You're right, I will die, but not from bullets. I've been dying since I turned 35. A man's life is divided. You live until you hit 35, then you start dying. I plan to live long enough to prove it's possible to serve time and still come out and become a successful businessman." Nearly a year later, Bumpy Johnson was sentenced to 15 years in prison. His lawyer, Henry Lowenberg, filed an appeal, arguing that a key witness, a special agent, had committed perjury during the trial. The agent testified that he had paid $450 and $675 for heroin, which had been delivered by an associate of Johnson while federal agents watched. Lowenberg took the case to the U.S. Court of Appeals, but the court unanimously rejected the request for a new trial. He then appealed to the Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. Johnson was sent to serve his sentence first at Leavenworth, then at Alcatraz. According to some sources, his former protégé Flash was an informant, and that he also framed Bumpy in this drug conspiracy. Flash claimed to the police that he was selling drugs for Bumpy, but the accusation didn't hold much weight. Even the narcotics officers were skeptical, as Bumpy had no known involvement in the drug trade at the time. His reputation was firmly rooted in numbers running and other enterprises, but drugs weren't part of his portfolio. However, the federal authorities saw an opportunity. Whether or not Bumpy was dealing drugs, they believed they could leverage him to clean up Harlem by pressuring him to give up the names of the real drug dealers operating in the neighborhood. This marked a turning point, as the feds were determined to use any means necessary to dismantle Harlem's rising narcotics trade. From that point forward, Bumpy poured a fortune into defending his innocence, determined to clear his name. But despite his efforts, it wasn't enough. The feds were relentless, refusing to back down. They pressured him constantly, demanding that he give up names in exchange for dropping the case. True to his character, Bumpy stood his ground, telling them to go to hell every time. Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem in 1963, after his release from prison, and although he was still respected and loved by the community, the neighborhood had changed dramatically. Harlem had deteriorated largely due to the influx of drugs, primarily brought in by the mafia leaders with whom Johnson had once cooperated. Political figures and civil rights leaders, including Bumpy's old friend Malcolm X, worked to highlight Harlem's struggles and advocate for its African American residents. Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X had been friends since the 1940s, back when Malcolm was a street hustler. Now, as a prominent leader, Malcolm X asked Bumpy for protection as he faced threats from members of the Nation of Islam, whom he had recently left. However, Malcolm X eventually decided that associating with a known criminal like Johnson was not in his best interest and requested that Bumpy withdraw his protection. Just a few weeks later, on February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by his enemies in Harlem. In 1967, Bumpy was arrested for attempting to smuggle drugs from Peru into the U.S., with the intent to distribute them in Harlem. In a dramatic car chase, federal agents pursued him from his Lenox Avenue home to the Van Wyck Expressway, eventually capturing him. Authorities suspected he was heading to the airport to flee to the Caribbean. However, no drugs were ever discovered. Released on $50,000 bail, Bumpy was having dinner at Wells Restaurant in Harlem on July 7, 1968, when he suffered a heart attack. He was taken to Harlem Hospital but was pronounced dead on arrival. Bumpy Johnson was survived by his wife Mamie, his daughters Ruthie and Elise. As Harlem bid farewell to its towering figure, Bumpy Johnson, the streets were ripe for change. Johnson's death in 1968 left a void in the criminal underworld, and the neighborhood was soon to witness the emergence of a new force, a man who would redefine the drug trade in Harlem. In the wake of Johnson's passing, a new name began to resonate through the alleyways and back rooms of Harlem: Frank Lucas. Immortalized or perhaps maybe fictionalized by Denzel Washington in the film American Gangster, Lucas brought a new era of ruthless innovation and unyielding control. His rise marked a dramatic shift in the criminal landscape, as he took advantage of the power vacuum to forge an empire that would leave an indelible mark on the streets of Harlem.